Keith Mcpeek. What to say about Keith? If I had to sum up Keith in one word, I would have to say passion. I meet very few people that share the passion like Keith does. He's quick to share information. He's constantly challenging the norm of husbandry and techniques that we've utilized for years to help not only benefit where we are in herpetoculture, but also to help benefit the animals ultimately. I can't really remember the first time Keith and I met. However, I'm sure with us both sharing our loves for Boelen's pythons, it made it pretty easy, and I felt instantly like I had ran into an old friend. That feeling of old friendship continued for years, and we still remain quite close. Keith is truly a pioneer, in my opinion, in herpetoculture and herp history. We can learn a lot from what Keith has experienced in his time, as well as what he's unlocking in the future. Like I said, a passionate person and an incredible wealth of knowledge. And I am very, very proud to call Keith a friend of mine.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Morelia Python Radio. And like promised in 2021, we're going to be doing things a little bit different. And we're going to be having installments throughout the year of a little series that I call Herp History. And basically, we're trying to just document the history of herpetoculture with the various people and that have sort of laid the groundwork for the hobby. I feel that for me, I keep getting older and older, and I feel that, at some point this has to be archived and documented so people understand where herpetoculture has come from and how far we have come today in 2021. But I couldn't think of a better person to start our first episode than our good friend Keith Mcpeek. Keith has been one of the most genuine persons I know. He has a passion, not just for reptiles, but animals in general. He just has this way of, getting inside their behaviors and understanding and trying to unlock the mystery of these animals that we keep. He's probably known today mostly for his emerald tree boas, locality boas, and of course, the Boelen eye. But Keith is not just that. He, to some people, is known as the short-tail python godfather, if you will. He is one of the guys that established and some of the morphs that some of the people are working with today are from Keith. And we were lucky enough to be able to herp with him in the Northern Territory a couple years ago. And man, that was a bond that we found an Owen Pelly python. There you go. We made it 1 minute. But I consider him not just somebody that I look up to in the hobby, but a very close friend. And I couldn't think of anybody better. Owen.
Yes.
What's your thoughts?
What you said. No, I'm sorry. The thing is that I may not have had too many interactions with Keith before we ended up going to Australia. We met a few times, and I know we had hung out at some Carpet Fest, but he was always somebody that was kind of plugged in over on with the Bloods and the Borneos. He was Matt's friend, and he was cool. He was very nice to me and all that fun stuff. But it took us going to Australia and kind of digging through, talking with Keith in the backseat of the car, or when we're dead tired and goofy wandering around aimlessly through the dark of Australia, to really kind of start realizing that he's a really cool guy and that he is plugged into everything and anything. That he bred jungle carpets when I think I was still in elementary school. It was all that kind of fun stuff that you kind of learned. And you're right. He can pick apart an animal just by looking at it. And he has a fascination with certain species that goes above and beyond. Like the fact that we had known Gavin for maybe 5 minutes, and like Keith and him were talking like they had been like best friends for eons about how this might affect Bull and I, and that this might how it would affect an Owen Pelly python, back and forth and back and forth. And I'm just sitting there in the middle watching these two people go, and I'm not saying a word because I'm just trying to drink in as much as I could. So it is those experiences and having that kind of a mind is what makes Keith so special, and they're invaluable to herpetoculture. If he wasn't here, the entire community would be lesser for it. And it's funny because you talk to other people and you mention him, they're like, "Oh God, I love him. We talk about this. We've been like up to like 3 a.m. one time talking about this kind of stuff," and it's all over the place, regardless of the species or who you're, what you keep. Some usually have some interaction with Keith Mcpeek, so it's awesome.
Yes, and we also have Rob's going to be coming along.
I don't have to say anything nice about Rob, do I?
We'll save that for another episode.
Good. I wasn't prepared for that either. So.
But yeah, Rob's going to be on the show with us because Rob was Rob, I'll let you tell. Maybe you have a story about Keith. I know back in the early days you were around.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I don't know if this is a story, but just Keith's and my story. How about that? It's not necessarily a hilarious story.
I like it. Yeah.
So I first met Keith back in 2003 at Daytona. That was the first time I'd been to Daytona, and being mid to West Coast guy, it was my first opportunity to meet him. Came over, got to see all the fogged over acrylics and be the pain in the butt. Wants him to try and clean one off so I could take a look at it. Chatting him up, totally loved his website. It was not particularly robust, but it was robust enough to have me with my own copybook sitting there going, in 5 years, I want to buy a blue ghost from Keith Mcpeek. So it was really,
oh my God.
really awesome. To go through that, and then to see, 17 going on 18 years later, that, where we're at, it's totally awesome. Couldn't have written it better or hoped for better.
Yeah, that's cool. Did you imagine that when you're standing there writing Blue Ghost in your copybook that, we would be herping the Northern Territory together? I mean,
no,
wild, right?
That's what I mean. It's crazy, right? That would be the
right
what would come to pass, and then to have just conversations about have him at the house, and then go to his house, and meet his family, and vice versa, and all this, to go out for supper, and he's having a Long Island, I'll have a beer and whatever, and it's all good. So it's really really special.
That is Keith's drink of choice. If people are listening and they want to get him something, just send him a Long Island iced tea. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into it. And let's go all the way back to the beginning. And hey Keith, glad to have you here and be our first guest in this series. And we're gonna go back to the beginning, all the way back to the beginning, and what it was like getting your first reptile. What was it like?
First, I gotta say though, I'm like blown away by what you guys just said. Like, I'm like, who are they talking about? Who is this guy?
He's looking around for the other guy. It's like, wait.
I'm very humbled to think that's how you guys feel about me. I really appreciate all those kind words. It's very nice of you guys. That's awesome. So the beginning, huh? Oh God, how to start the beginning? So I was definitely a weird kid, Yeah. I mean, I definitely was more of a loner, and I think from day one, I was just always into anything wildlife. My brother was 8 years older than me, and so I mean, at the age of 3, I was playing with yellow rat snakes and boa constrictors and rubber boas. I mean, back in the day, you could get pretty much anything you want at a local pet store. There wasn't any regulations or anything like that. So we always had some cool stuff in the house from day one. As far back as I can remember, there was just animals like that in the house. And my uncle was an exotic vet and a farm vet in Blairstown, New Jersey. And he always had cool stuff there too. So, I mean, I just grew up around this stuff. And I can remember even as a kid, I would be catching flies and putting them in a bottle. And people would be like thinking that I'm like some strange kid torturing flies, but it was because I wanted to see them and see them on the glass and watch how they moved around on the glass and all. I can remember I had this one uncle, we called him Uncle Andy, and I can remember him sitting behind me while I'm looking in his jar, and I'm probably like 4 or 5 years old at the time. I remember him slapping my mom on the back and saying, "That kid's going to be a scientist one day. Look at him. Look at those flies." You know? And he knew why I was looking at the flies, and I let him go. You know, I was looking at the flies just to see how they do what they do. I wasn't, you know, one of these kids pulling the wings off of flies to torture them. I was actually trying to see what was going on, you know. Right. And then, you know, as you get a little bit older, and, you know, back in my day, it was black and white TV as a kid with antenna on your roof, and you got 13 channels. But man, every Saturday morning I was watching Tarzan, or I was watching, you know, some other kind of Mutual Omaha's Wild Kingdom or whatever. I can just remember, like, even like watching a monitor walk, I was fascinated by how they kind of had that canter sway back and forth, but the way they would lift their foot up and their fingers would almost drag on the ground before they lifted it up at that last second and placed it down before they took their next step. Like all that kind of weird stuff. And I could find myself, my mother would come into the living room, and there I am trying to walk across the floor like a Komodo dragon, you know, and she's like, "What the hell are you doing?" Or I'd be eating salad at the dinner table, and I'd be imitating the iguana my brother had, trying to, you know, wolf down the salad and stuff. And they were like, "Man, you are a strange kid," you know. But that stuff just fascinated me, you know, and I kind of just always adhered to the behaviors of animals. And you know, like I say, back in the day, you could get anything you wanted. We had this guy called Frankie, and I think I maybe told you guys about this. This guy was a guy that would go to all the local pet stores, and then he would go to the wholesalers and drop off to the pet stores what they wanted. And somehow we wound up befriending this guy. So Frankie used to make a stop at our house too, and he'd pull up in his car and he'd open his trunk and his back door, and he'd have boxes of all these different lizards and snakes and monkeys and everything else. And, you know, if you had some money on you that day, you bought a couple animals off of Frankie, you know. And that was kind of cool because back in the day, people didn't have a real interest in reptiles. So, you know, green lacerdas were coming in, or leopard lizards, and, you know, nobody was going through them holding back gravid animals or anything like that. So you'd be getting all these, I'd be getting animals at, you know, 5 to 10 years old that were gravid and getting a chance to try to hatch some eggs and stuff, you know.
Wow.
But back then, you know, you didn't have all the equipment that you have nowadays. So, you know, me and my infinite wisdom, I would be trying to hatch leopard lizard eggs with a hairdryer blowing on the ground, you know, trying to keep the ground warm, because you didn't have any information. You didn't have any internet. All you would say is, "Hey, a chicken keeps their eggs warm, so maybe reptile eggs need to be kept warm too." And, you know, you'd go for it. And of course, I didn't hatch anything back then. But it was just a study of the animals that always fascinated me for the longest time, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Was there a particular reptile that you had as a pet that you remember that stands out to you? Whether it was either your very first one or the one that made the biggest impact on you?
There was two that we had. This very large male iguana that had a typical large male iguana. And I can't even remember his name, but we had a boa constrictor also at the same time called Cuddles. and yeah, we actually named reptiles back then in the Mcpeek house, believe it or not.
Perfect.
And those two animals probably were the first animals that they were my brothers, but they were the first animals, like I say, I was 3 to 5 years old, that I got to interact with. And I can remember taking a shot from that iguana on my face from the tail.
Ooh.
and being like, wow, what the hell was that? Like, I had no idea that they did that or anything else. And I was hooked from then on. I had to figure out why he hit me with his tail, what that was all about. And, just all that kind of stuff. But they just hooked me on it. Watching that iguana and watching that boa constrictor, I was hooked. And I would go out in the field and try to catch, back then we used to have green snakes that were local to us, and we had garter snakes and even blue-tailed skinks and all, like right in my backyard. We have a rock wall. And I'd go back there hunting and just try to be like my big brother and try to get a snake or a lizard or something that I could keep in captivity like he was, And the funny thing is when my brother got about, I'm going to say maybe 20 years old, all of a sudden he developed a fear of snakes and he was scared to death of snakes.
Really?
It was the weirdest thing, like it grew in me, but at some point it just started freaking him out. And, then of course the little brother with the snake and big scared brother,
Yeah,
being scared of
well,
snakes.
did it? Yeah.
No, I think he got more interested in chasing girls than animals at that point,
Right.
But those two animals, it was an iguana and I we had other stuff before that, but those two animals are really when I started understanding things about them and wanting to keep stuff myself,
Right. Was there a point where you see today, right? The progression is like you get a reptile and then, you start to, want to, obviously there's a lot more information out today and access to that information is at your fingertips. What was it like to be in the reptile hobby, quote unquote, and becoming serious with reptiles? I mean, did you just stop at those two animals or
No, it was never stopped. And you got to realize the books back then did not cater to captive husbandry because nobody was keeping them for more than just being an oddity, really. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So books that you got were basically field information, and you had to take field information and decipher that into how that would work in captivity. So yeah, no, I was always collecting from day one. You got to realize though, like my uncle was this exotic vet, and like when I went there, I was a kid of 5 years old playing with a tiger cub or a black panther cub walking around in his house, or a capuchin monkey or a spider monkey or different birds. And he had a chimpanzee there once,
Oh boy.
and I would go there and he would just all of a sudden say, "Hey Keith, here's a bag for you." And I'd open it up and there would be like a 12-foot Suriname boa in there, wild caught. And he would send me home with it, so like it wasn't unusual or strange or anything in our house because you never knew what was coming here. I mean, I've had capuchin monkeys for a long time and squirrel monkeys in the house. And we had parrots that were loose in the house. And my parents were if it would keep me out of trouble and I was taking care of it, I could pretty much get whatever I want, I mean, 10 years old and I had a 3-foot spectacle caiman in my room in a fish tank, But, your husbandry, as we got older and information started to get better in the hobby and people saw that there was more people getting into it and products were starting to be made, then care for these animals started getting better and better and your success with them got better and better. We did fantastic with local species because, your household environment kind of catered to them, but we didn't know enough about Burmese pythons or, even Colombian boas or anything at that time. So a lot of times, if an animal made it, even past a year or two, you thought you were doing fantastic, It took a while for that technology to catch up with how you kept in the hobby. So rat snakes and corn snakes and garter snakes and water snakes, they all, you'd keep them 5-10 years, no problem. But the more exotic stuff, you'd get it and hope for the best with it because you really didn't know what the heck you were doing back then.
Yeah.
I'm talking in the 60s and early 70s,
And I would imagine that all that stuff is all wild caught, right? So you're already...
Yeah, nobody was captive breeding. I mean, I'm sure guys like Tom Crutchfield and our new friend Richard Ross, and guys like that in the 60s and 70s were starting to breed stuff, but they were older than I was at that time. So for me, all it was is about getting a species. It was probably more along the lines of like what some people do with tropical fish. It's just to have something in the house to watch and look at and study more than, breeding wasn't even thought about back in the day. For me and the people that I associated with in the hobby, it was strictly to observe and just keep alive.
When do you
Right.
think the shift happened to it becoming a breeding thing?
80s and 90s, late
Okay.
80s and 90s. Yeah. And the 90s is when just everything exploded, really, where everything with internet became more accessible and big shows started happening. I think this is the 32nd year this year for the National Reptile Show, which would put that at around 1990 when that came about. And that was really a big turning point for the hobby in and of itself. Just that show taking off,
Mm-hmm.
Was that one of the very first reptile shows?
I can't remember. Maybe Rob knows if Pottstown in PA and a couple other little local shows may have been before it. There may have been some small, like, believe it or not. So there was this show, and Matt may know about this show, but there was a show in Pottstown, PA,
Mm-hmm.
and back then, like, Mark Bell was doing the shows, but Mark Bell would get a table there in PA, and Brian Barczyk literally had a table smaller than mine back then, with a couple animals in it. And that may have been a show before the national show down in Orlando originally, and then Daytona. But that was really what turned the tide when that show came around, and then every show just kind of tried to mirror that and gain the success it did, but it never happened for the first 20 years anyway. That was the show,
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, I guess we'll jump into that real quick and just maybe talk about that. What did you vend that first show? Did you attend that first show?
I did it. I did it from the very first show. Now, when I first started doing that show, it was impossible to get a table. So what I did was Dan and Phil that owned New York Reptilia, where Quetzal used to work.
Mm-hmm.
Quetzal was like a 15-year-old kid when I was going there. They used to get a table down there, and they would bring their animals down, and then they would get an extra table for me. So for the first few years, I was vending the show, but I was vending it under their name because I just couldn't get my own table, and I went on a waiting list. And to give you an idea of how that show was in the beginning, Kevin McCurley would have a spot on a table, a friend of his, and literally have like 4 ball pythons. So in the beginning, compared to what Kevin does nowadays, that's how he started out. There was different names back then that were the big players. But yeah, I did that from the very first show all the way up in, I think, to 2012 or 2013 was the last time I vended the show.
Wow. How do you even prepare for, you're going into the unknown, right?
Yeah. So, my whole thing with the shows, and I've talked to you guys about before, was shock and awe. I'm like, I'm going to bring everything. And, back then I really wasn't as concerned about, there wasn't like all these things like nidovirus out there or any of these other things. So like I'd bring the best of the best that I had and as many babies as I could fit. And in the beginning, I would just, you'd put him in a trunk and you'd check him on his luggage before 9/11. And they didn't even care. They'd open it up and they would look at it and they'd question it. And I would show them the rules and regulations on their thing that pets can travel like that. And I would always have a little bit of a hassle at check-in, but they always let it through. And that's how I was getting down there. And then after 9/11, that clamped down. So we had to start driving down. So I was bagging up and, bringing maybe, 10 adults and, up to 200 baby animals down on a drive down to Florida in the car. I didn't do a trailer like Matt does or anything. So everything was in the car. Then Teresa would always be very happy if we could make it out of Jersey before the first snake shit stunk out the car, You got an adult blood python. You basically got something like a Great Dane that's letting loose in the car, So,
And
we'd stop at a
they
rest
all
stop and
crap.
try to
Yeah.
wash them out. Yeah, it was an adventure every time we went down to Florida. But that's what I did at the shows. I just tried to get 2 or 3 tables and bring everything that was the best of the best. And I was the only guy at the shows with nothing but bloods and short tails on it. So it kind of stuck out to everybody, because if they wanted bloods or short tails, I'd be the first table they'd stop at, knowing that I'd have a lot of animals,
Right. How does the level of species or the number of species compare to, say, what you see today? Was it more of just a huge variety of species? Or
Yeah, but you got to remember, in the very beginning, we weren't desensitized to species. So
Mhm.
seeing a leopard gecko would blow you away, because you just had, and the internet was just kind of catching on in the early days and all that kind of stuff. So you didn't get this instant information like you do today. So I can remember the first crested geckos down in Daytona. People were just blown away that there's these little lizards with these spikes over their eyes. And, people that I thought saw everything were blown away by what we would consider not even a second look today, because everybody's just like desensitized to what's really in front of them, take it for granted,
Mhm.
yeah, for sure. I know. Any of you guys got anything you want to hit on?
I mean, like, what was the one animal that blew you away, Keith? That, like, when it emerged on the scene, that you were like, it had like just kind of knocked your socks off. Something you never thought you'd either see in person or have in person.
Well, there's a couple species. So there was a lot of stuff that was available, and you would hear about it being available in Europe and not making it to the States. But like, like just seeing even their kind of top animals today, but green Sanzinia, Woma, blackhead, Bolanai, like when you saw the first one of any of those species at a show, it like the crowd around that table was just insane. You'd have to wait 20 minutes to try to make your way in to get a shot and a look at that animal, And I can just remember those always being like dream species that you hoped would be in Daytona. And then Daytona, like, nobody gave away what was going to be there. So like you went there with these expectations that, you didn't know what you were going to see, because, that would be the first time that you actually did see a blackhead python in person or a Bolanai in person. And, you only saw maybe 3 pictures in a book that was available at the time, and never even thought you would see one in person,
So,
I mean, even Burmese pythons back then were amazing.
Jesus.
Sometimes, right, Keith, then there'd be the extra spicy stuff that would be even more fancy now, in terms of, there was that year that the Japanese folks had all those shinglebacks, and then there was
Yeah.
the guy
Oh my
who's
God.
in over off the west coast of Europe, that island down, the island nation down there. He had brought a bunch of Agurnia Cunninghami, the Cunningham skin,
Uh-huh.
all that sort of stuff. And heck, it was so crazy, right, that I remember one year a guy that was in our group, that was checking out the show, came back insistent that there was a Moloch, and it wound up being a carving of a Moloch. But it was so realistic, and
Yeah.
to give an idea of what the possibility, right, that you're talking about, Keith. It was like there was a 30% chance that there was actually a Moloch at the show, based on what I had seen.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you're right. I remember those shinglebacks. They were just blowing you away when you saw them. They were incredible.
That is awesome.
Yeah, I kind of remember like my first reptile show, and it was like kind of like almost like going to the zoo, because you're going to see species that, to me, it was like the zoo 2.0, I mean, I can only imagine in those days.
Yeah, back then, I mean, you saw stuff that zoos wish they had. You know what I mean? Like before the shows, like my most exotic reptiles were my sister and her husband. He was in the military in Texas, and he was stationed at all different bases down there, and we would go for a visit. And one time I got to go and stay for almost 4 weeks, and all I did was herp every day by myself. They would say, just check in. You didn't have cell phones or anything else, and I'm like a 15, 16, 17-year-old kid running around in Texas trying to catch rattlesnakes and all these other kind of things. And my sister would just be like, just check in at lunchtime and around dinner time, just so we know you're okay.
Christ.
And they're like, and if you're in the ravine and you hear a rumbling like a train coming towards you, that's a flash flood that's probably happened 30 miles away. Make sure you get out of the ravine before the water hits you. And I was just on my own down there catching curly tail lizards and different bull snakes or gopher snakes and all kinds of cool stuff. And up until the first shows, that was like when we went to Oz, and how blown away I was with you guys there. And, I can remember coming back, and even 2 years later, I'd be, having a migraine or something like that. I can remember laying in bed and just thinking about the excursions I was doing down in Texas, looking for these different reptiles just to kind of calm down and soothe myself and all, because it was just such an insane trip,
Right.
So like Rob says, when these shows started, like, you're seeing this exotic stuff from around the world that importers were able to get their hands on so easily compared to nowadays. You saw more stuff than you do see nowadays, I guess, in a way, right, Rob? I mean, sun gazers and all kinds of stuff you would see there.
It seems to me now, if there's any hope for that sort of stuff, it's probably in amphibians and turtles and things, things that are a little bit more obscure. But
right,
you'll see remember the year there was all those caiman lizard, and now we've become desensitized to it. But there was a year where it was like, what is this?
You never thought you would see a caiman lizard, yeah.
That's so cool. It's almost like we have less species to choose from now, but we are allegedly have more. So it's just kind of like that. But like Keith, I got into snakes and stuff like that in early 2000s in college, so I never really got to experience some of the stuff that you're talking about as far as shows. But I mean, the other thing that I always like talking with you guys that have done it for so long is how you guys purchased reptiles. Like, how is it different from when you first started? So, like, I know you said you had the friend with the traveling zoo that he let you buy out of the back of his car or something.
Yeah,
like that.
it was that, or I can remember going to there was a pet store, and what I found out was that there was very close to me a couple wholesalers that would get all these reptiles in, and if I snuck in there and act like I belonged in there, they wouldn't kick me out for a while, and so I would try to save up as much money as I could, because I also found out that if they did question me and were trying to kick me out, if I was going to spend $50 in there, at the time was like spending $500 now, probably, they would let me spend my money before they kicked me out.
Right.
So I was finding like Spilotus in there and all kinds of really cool stuff. But other than that, my only shot at getting anything cool that I wanted was a local pet store. There was one called Casmer's and one called Robbins. And now, believe it or not, you would go in there and you would buy indigos by the foot. They were $10 a foot.
Oh, my God.
So they would have Eastern indigos in a 10-gallon tank or a 20-gallon tank or a 50-gallon tank. And they sold them by the foot. He would literally take them out and he would put a tape measure on them, and it was $10 a foot. And that was a high price tag back in the day. They also had tanks full of mud puppies and hellbenders and all kinds of really crazy stuff. But if you went in there and you said, like, an iconic species for me as a kid that I always wanted, and it just represented the South American rainforest, was an emerald tree boa, hence why I'm into emerald tree boas now. But as a kid, I always wanted one. Every time I'd go in a store and I'd have to give them a deposit and I'd say I'd want an emerald tree boa, every time I would wind up. And Rob, I think they were actually Granadas, or I don't think they were Amazons. I can't, I was so young back then. I couldn't.
They would call them more cook eye, and I think some of them were, but especially
and that's what I would get, and they would tell me it's an emerald. I'm like, that's not an emerald, and they're like, yes, it is. I'd be so disappointed. Meanwhile, now I would kill for that snake, But yeah, I would take it home. And I can remember I had one that just would not eat. And I'm probably like 12, 13 years old, and it would not eat, would not eat, would not eat. So we had this one red maple tree in our front yard, and there was nothing else around it. And I pruned the branches to like 6 feet off the ground, and I let that snake go in that tree. And it stayed in that tree for damn near the whole summer. And I swear it was catching little sparrows or something that in that tree, because it started to put on weight and started to like come back and look really good. And I brought it in the winter and subsequently killed it. You know, I couldn't keep it alive, but it was doing great outside. But and I can remember asking, I wanted those green horned frogs. You know, I just wanted one of the horned frogs, and I wound up getting one of those leaf frogs. Like, you would ask for stuff, you would have to pay for it, or give them at least a hefty deposit before they would try to track one down for you. And whatever they got, you had to take it. And it was never what you wanted. It was never what you wanted, but you had to take it, because otherwise they would never try to get you something down the road, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
So like when you started getting mail lists from Crutchfields and Gulf Coast Reptiles and all these different places in Florida, you could actually pick and get that animal, even though it may have been in horrible shape or whatever, but you were getting what you wanted. That was like a huge step forward for me, you know?
Were you actually getting that animal? Like, because like, would they send pictures, or could you
No.
request pictures? Or was that
No, no, that was it. Like, you know, like, you know, the old price list, like that's how I got my first croc monitors. I got them from Tom, and sure enough, he did sex them correctly even back then.
it?
And I got eggs from them, but I never went any further than that. And I wound up trading them off something because they were so expensive for me to feed back then.
Yeah.
But I just asked for a pair, if you could, croc monitors, sight unseen, send your money and you get what you want. That's how I got my first Borneo short tails. They were the newly discovered island blood python is how they represented them on the. Everything was newly discovered, newly rediscovered,
And always
Wait,
and that's how I got my first
right?
Borneo
Best they've ever seen.
short tails.
100%.
Well, then
Yeah,
the newly discovered, but then you find out that they were described in like the 1800s. It's like newly
Right.
discovered my foot. Like, I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
Hank was always
Yep.
the best with the flourishes like that. In terms
Yeah.
of the annotations that said,
Yeah.
"Oh, the best I've ever seen," or some new subspecies or whatever.
I was telling Eric before we went on the air a funny story about Hank Malt is when I first bred Sanzinian, I had the first litter back in the day, and they had a lot of value to them, and I was really had my eye on monitors. I actually traded a pair of Sanzinia to Hank Malt for 5 baby Gallardi, and that's how I got Gallardi back in the day when they were really rare and hard to find. The Sanzinia just happened to be a little bit rare and a little bit harder to get back then, especially captive born.
Still sounds like a good deal. Do it every time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's.
Yeah.
I mean, and now you're going back around again, where you might get a litter of Sanzinia that are rare again, or still
Yeah.
rare. It's like
The greens are
not
hard.
changing.
Yeah. What's old is new again.
Right.
The circle.
So back in the early days, how did you meet fellow reptile keepers? Like,
You
where
didn't, man. If you were lucky, the store owners back then, they really could care less about what was in their shop. I hate to say, they just wanted to make sales, so they weren't really reptile people that could mentor you or anything like that. And if you were really lucky and you were in there and you happen to bump into somebody looking at the same animal and start a conversation and they were local to you, you'd be lucky to be able to pick up your house phone and maybe give them a call and talk to them. But really, until the shows started, for me anyway, is when I really started connecting with other people. But for me, it was always been the animals anyway. Like I say, I was always kind of a loner. And so I was quite content just having my animals and being by myself. And when odd people came over to the house, my parents' friends or whoever, And, my parents would say, "Oh, show them your snakes," or something. Like, I would give them a lecture and a half and be so happy to have somebody to talk to. I mean, there was times literally, like, I would have a boa constrictor and my mom would get on the phone and call the neighbors, "Hey, Keith's going to feed the snake." And they would come over to watch me feed the snake,
Yeah.
because, back then it was putting a live rat in a cage and letting it walk around a little bit and letting the boa constrictor nail it. So, all the women would scream and all the husbands would be laughing, and it was like a big event, and then everybody would have a drink and go home. It was kind of the thing that you did back then.
Yeah. I remember that being a big thing my dad used to do in the neighborhood for the kids. It would be like, oh, he's going to feed the snakes. And, all the kids would come over and we all be lined up just watching them feed, chicks and rats to snakes,
Yeah. Yeah.
Getting to meet and start knowing Keith Mcpeek was a huge influence on me. Going to the big shows and starting to go up to his table and see a guy that was keeping all Borneos and blood pythons at a time when that wasn't a real popular thing, and me wanting to basically focus on them, and that's what I was really into, was huge for me. And besides his animals speaking for themselves of how awesome they looked and all the work he put into them, Keith's approach to it and his eye for detail and everything he had planned for how he would increase things and add things into it really changed and molded my way of thinking even further than what I had in my head already. Over time, getting to know Keith even more and his family, I always would say, Keith is like family, but at this point, I can honestly say Keith is family. And when we get together, talking animals is the main thing, and we can go on about that forever, but just talking about life and stupid subjects, I can carry on with Keith anything, and it's interesting, and I feel, comfortable around him and his family, and it's a great thing. Keith's just an amazing keeper, an amazing person, and really glad I got to meet him early on. He's one of my oldest friends since I came back into reptiles from when I was a kid, and I'm just really lucky to have known him and have the relationship I do with him. So, definitely top one, number one on my list, Keith Mcpeek.
For today's keepers, right? You have YouTube and social media and podcasts and all this stuff for people to find people that they sort of look up to or try to, pick their brain or whatever. I guess probably for me, Owen and Bob Rock there, it's probably Mark O'Shea, Steve Irwin, guys like that. Like who was it in your day? Did you even have anybody?
No, it was Mutual Omaha's Wild Kingdom, man. That was it. You watch Marlon Perkins tell Tom, I forget the guy's name, Tom, to get out of the van and wrestle the anaconda, and while he stands in the truck there, and watches. Yeah. And like I say, until I started going to shows, like Frankie was my guy. Like Frankie was the guy for reptiles, and he was just a salesman too, but at least he knew where certain species came from, and I was fascinated just to get that information. Or he'd tell me this one likes crickets, but this one prefers spiders, or this one, he would give you and that information alone, you're like, wow, this guy knows so much about these things, and meanwhile he was just throwing me a line of shit, but I was taking a hook, line, and sinker because there was no access to anything like that. You got to remember, like I say, there was no phone numbers of Don Hamper to give a call to or anything like that. There was just mainly the books, like I say, on wild accounts of animals. Nobody was breeding anything back then.
Yeah.
Right.
So
what was your most cherished book?
Yeah, Eric beat me to it.
I think it was called The Field Guide to North American Snakes, and it was a little black book, and one of the species that always fascinated me, and I had no idea they literally lived around me because I never found them until recently, was black rat snakes. To me, that was like one of the most exotic snakes in North America. And because they called them, they called them pilot snakes, and they had all these cool names for them. And them or black racers, either one to me was like one of the most fascinating snakes if I could ever find. Now when Teresa and I go on hikes, like I jump over them because there's so many of them in the one park we go to. They're like all over the place, And actually about 2 years ago, man, there was one specimen that I could not get my hands on. It was huge. I mean, it was girthy. It was like almost as big around as my wrist. And I mean, it was like indigo size. And I made a couple dives for it, but it was too fast when I couldn't get my hands on it, just get a couple pictures of it. That animal made me go right back to my childhood and like being blown away of black rat snakes,
Yeah.
I really
100%.
thought you were going to say Eastern hogs there, Keith. I know for me, the same experience of looking at the field guide, Eastern hogs not being here, that was, I really thought that's what you were going to say.
Yeah, no, black rat. Rob, the book, what is the name of the book? It's the old book, and it's white, and it has like hand-drawn pictures of all the species of reptiles and frogs in North America. And they don't outline them all, but they have maybe, a total of 50 animals. And that was another book that was a classic to me. I'll have to take a picture of that, Eric, and send it to you. But that book, I still have that book and look back in it just for nostalgia, to go back and get that mindset of being a kid again, and awe that the United States actually had a crocodile that lived within the borders of the United States. That to me was like mind-boggling. Or that we had alligator snappers, and for a long time, that's the stuff that blew me away. But then when the shows came around, and I got in that mentality of being a breeder more than being there for the animals, I lost that for a while, and I was just chasing that next thing to breed or the next morph to create. And I think as you get older, I see it with Tom Crutchfield's posts on Facebook and a lot of other old keepers. It seems, people kind of revert back to going back to that first love of, think about an alligator snapping turtle. If you did not live in the United States, how cool would that be of a species of an animal that you would hope to see one day if you lived in Australia or Europe or someplace else?
I mean, we're spoiled with rattlesnakes. Like we don't
exactly.
We take rattlesnakes for granted. Other people are insane about them. Nipper,
right?
So yeah,
Nipper, yeah. Nipper comes to mind. Yeah,
yeah. Okay, so I guess let's shift gears a little bit into the next. I'm assuming at this point you're getting, more. Keeping is becoming more. What was like? Well, let's do this real quick. What was like the first piece of? There you go. I've had that book. Yes.
You found the book?
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah, a guide to familiar American species, reptiles, and amphibians.
There you go.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yep.
Who wrote that book, Rob? Just in case people want to.
So it's a golden nature guide.
Right.
Let's see if it has Herbert Zim and Hobart Smith. Hobart Smith, there you go.
Nice.
Okay.
Yeah. I have all the pictures in that book ingrained in my head.
Can you imagine Hobart Smith as the junior author on a book?
Right. That actually is probably the first book and my Bible as a kid growing up that I would probably thumb through at least once or twice a day,
Right.
That's awesome.
What what was the transition from being a keeper to wanting to go into breeding? Like, when did that trigger for you? What?
I guess success. One of the first animals that I was successful with, and it wasn't because I bred them, but I got a gravid pair of Jackson chameleons, and the female within 4 days of getting it dropped this litter of babies.
Oh, wow.
And I was successful in raising those babies. And that success just was like, okay, this can be done. It's, not out of the realm. You just got to really think things out. And, you couldn't buy fruit flies or anything for these little guys. So you had to get creative and cut apples up and put them outside and then quickly net over top of them to get fruit flies. and then get them loose in your house and have your mother freaking out because they didn't sell wingless fruit flies,
Oh
you know.
God.
And
Oh,
then as they
God.
grew, you'd put out either a stake on the picnic table to attract the green flies, or you would look for your dog's crap in the yard and try to catch the green flies off of that and bring them in as the chameleon babies were growing. And just being successful in raising those baby chameleons was probably what set me off on starting to think, hey, I can not only keep these things, but maybe I can figure out how to breed different things, you know? So that started the journey for sure on trying to get pairs of animals and just instead of single animals.
So how did that work? Like, what was, like, I mean, what, I don't know. When you bought an animal, you bought them as pairs? Did you have to wait years to complete a project?
How long did it take to pair something up back then when you don't know when the next one was going to pop up?
Well, so then what happened is what I started doing was I figured out that there was this thing local to me called the Wanad Press. And in the Wanad Press, it was like a little paper flyer that came out every week. It's maybe 200 pages long, and guys would be selling cars and they'd be selling all these different things, but there was a pet section. And if you look through the pet section, you would find out need to get rid of red-tailed boa constrictor, or needed to get rid of whatever because they bought it in a store and realized they can't take care of it, or they lost interest after the shine wore off of it or whatever. And you could go to these places and actually pick them up either for free just to get them out of their people's houses, or practically for nothing. So I would literally go and just try to get boas were a big thing for me, just, Colombian boas. And that was the first snake species I ever bred. I got Colombian boas, and I can remember having 2 pairs and 2 females, and I was successful breeding them to 1 male, and both females dropped their litters on the very exact same day, and they both had 32 babies, and no slugs or nothing else. Like, it was perfect, and they dropped each other within hours of each other. I'm like, what the heck is going on with that?
Right.
Because I never thought in a million years like you would have 2 gravid animals and they go in the same time, they're in the cycle, and nobody knew about ovulation or pre-lay sheds or any of this kind of stuff then. So that was all inspiring in itself, and that's probably the turning point for me to really start focusing more on snakes. And so I had I had 64 baby boas to deal with, which you didn't run to the store and buy Tupperwares. You didn't have that access to, so everything was in like 5-gallon aquariums back then, and all of them keeping these things in there and trying to figure out what to do with them all. So go to the local pet stores, and those guys, man, they would scoff them up left and right because they have never seen captive born baby boa constrictors, and they're seeing dollar signs. So they were very easy to sell back then. And that's, kind of what started. I didn't do it for the money. It was really cool. And I kind of sold them just to get rid of them so I didn't have to take care of so many animals. But then I'm like, hey, I just made a couple $100. I can go out and get this, that, or the other thing, So that's kind of what started it all, working hard, trying to breed things to generate cash to go buy more things.
Snake money.
Because it was
always needs
exactly,
snake money. Yeah.
Exactly. Before you had a real full-time job and you were looking, I'm raking leaves in neighbors' yards or anything else I could do to earn a few bucks to go buy the next thing that I wanted to get. And once you started breeding, you're like, hey, this can actually pay for itself in a way. So put your efforts into that. And that's kind of how the whole thing breeding started.
How did you go about even like having an idea of how to set up a baby boa? Like what?
Yeah.
Walk us
Well,
through.
the high-tech equipment back then was, you got to remember the original tanks that people used were actually probably better for reptiles than glass. Not that glass aquariums are the ideal thing now, but back then they were metal framed and they had slate bottoms.
Okay, yeah, all right, yeah.
So when you got the high-tech equipment back then was those stick-on heating pads, and when you put that on the bottom of a slate bottom tank, it dissipated the heat, so it wasn't such a fine, heat spot in one location like it is on a glass tank.
Right.
And that's probably why I was successful with the boas, using that. And I think that's kind of like, the first piece of equipment that I probably ever bought for reptiles was those stick-on heat pads.
I even think back then, like you probably didn't even have like a 6 outlet, like power strip. So it's like all these
No,
plugs plugged into the outlet, like the Christmas time,
no. And like, the additional heaters that anybody would have were like kerosene heaters or something like that. Like there wasn't these DeLongo oil-filled radiant heaters or anything else. So that you were never even thinking about heating the whole room. And creating an ambient warmer temperature, and maybe with a basking spot, you were just trying to heat that tank,
Right. So, chameleons, first species that you had babies and were successful. The boas. What was like the first breeding project that you went after? I want to keep these, breed these. Did it? Were successful with it. What was that? What was that species?
It was definitely colubrids. King snakes were starting to become more available, and I always had a fascination with king snakes, so I'd get into the colubrids. But I always had, it was about having a lot of species back then and not concentrating on one species. Like when I finally did start with short tails and bloods, so you would have king snakes and maybe some corn snakes, but you would also have a pair of boas and a pair of rainbow boas or a pair of dumal boas or whatever else you could get your hands on. You just had a pair of this and a pair of that, and it was, depending on how you're recycling your room, because you really didn't know what was going on, certain species would breed, and the ones that bred for you were the ones that you kind of gravitated toward to try to get more of either the similar species or more of that species. And it kind of kept just building that way, But then as your expertise and your experience and all this kind of stuff starts building, then you start finding out, hey, you can divide the room up and you can keep the boids in here and the king snakes in there and maybe a few monitors, in this room, and separating it up. But there's nothing like a single species room to really learn that animal.
Right.
I don't think I'll ever know an animal or feel as confident talking about an animal as I do bloods and short tails. Just spent too much time with them, with nothing else in the room to even think about except those animals. And I say you can always learn, but I swear I could think what they were going to do before they knew what they were going to do themselves. You just get to that point when you're that focused, and you have 50 adult breeders and another 75 to 150 animals that you're raising up for future projects, and then a whole bunch of babies that are on the market for sale. You just tend to you know a little about a lot, but I knew a lot about them for sure. And those are the animals that I'll always feel comfortable with until my mind starts going and I forget all the stuff that I learned about them.
So was it notebooks, index cards, tape?
Rolls of parchment.
I would imagine
stone slabs that you carved into. What was it, Keith?
I would imagine it was back then it was like
it was a stone and a chisel and a hammer.
I knew it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it wasn't that far back. Yeah. So you didn't have anything with computers or anything like that. It was just an index card on there for basic records. But to be honest with you, man, I always kind of just went by feel. Even today, like, I'll be talking to somebody and we're like, oh, how much did that animal weigh? And I'll be like, shit, I have no idea, man. I don't have any clue.
Right.
And to me, I get the importance of all that. And thank God for the guys that do keep all these records and all that stuff. Like, Jeff Murray was having me weigh each one of my baby Rauschenbergeri for his records and all, and I was doing it for him and definitely not for me. And I appreciate the people that put the time in it for me, for that, for the hobby. But for me, it's always just like, it it almost stresses me out too much to have all those records to look back on, because then if some animal is not adhering to those records, like that Rauschenberger eye that I had this year, that female did the weirdest thing that, you would never believe could happen, where she drops one baby. She shed 3 times before she dropped her litter, which was very unusual, all within about 4 weeks of dropping the babies. Then she dropped one baby. Then, like 4 days later, I thought she was done, and she drops 2 more babies. And then, like another day later, she drops like 7 babies. It was just the weirdest thing. And if you have that on record, then you look back and say, hey, this could happen. But for me, looking back on records always stresses me out. If most stuff is going on 32 days and this one's at 42, what the heck is going on? Should I bring it to a vet and stress it out and this and that?
Yeah.
So I always kind of go by feel with the animals, and didn't do a whole lot of record keeping when I was first starting out, especially,
In those days, did you have like a goal that you wanted to figure out that season? Like, I would imagine that each year a new thing unlocks, especially if you're keeping like, a specific.
Yeah, but you got to remember, in the first days, nobody really cared about morphs. Ball pythons brought on morphs before that, and Burmese pythons were before ball pythons. The albino Burm, that created a lot of hysteria. And then when Bob Clark got the albino retic, that created a lot of hysteria. But before that, man, it was just, wow, you bred Colombian boas? Oh my God,
Right.
I want some of them babies. And it didn't matter even what they looked like. It was just that it was a captive born Colombian boa that people were blown away by and wanted. There was nothing, nobody cared about widow peaks or color of the tail or lineage back to this animal or any of that shit, It was just that, yeah, you bred that animal and now you have babies for sale. It didn't matter how red the blood python was or any of that kind of stuff. It was just that it was captive born was insane compared to wild caught,
Keith, how was shipping babies? Like, how did you do that when you first
had
started?
to do cargo back then. Everything was air cargo.
Wow.
Yeah. So you had before 9/11, it was no big deal. You didn't even have to call in advance or anything else. You just called to find out a flight time for the area you're going to, and you went down and you didn't need anything. You just said it was a live snake and they took it and off it went. Then, restrictions started getting harder where after 9/11, they had to come to your house and inspect. When you wanted to be a known shipper with United or Delta Dash, Delta was the guys I always used. So I had to get an inspector come to the house to make sure I was doing a legitimate snake breeding in the house before they would let you ship from it. Because, after the terrorist attacks, they were worried that, you were setting up an account to be able to ship and it wasn't even a real address or anything. So sometimes they would come and they wouldn't even come in your house. They just wanted to make sure it was a real address and you were a real person. And they gave you your certificate to be a known shipper. So once, Ship Your Reptiles and all these other guys came around, that was huge for the industry because anybody could ship at that point,
Yeah.
I think from talking with people, it seems like I was one of the last batch of people that had to send a test package to FedEx to be an approved reptile shipper. After that, I don't think anybody's ever done it after me. So,
yeah. Yeah, and before that, it was just selling local. Hey, Frankie, I got a bunch of babies. You want to come get them and sell them to the pet stores? Or it wasn't, you weren't worrying about market value or an animal holding its value and all that kind of stuff. And back then, pet stores were the main outlet for it. So you didn't realize that maybe you're selling it to a pet store that's then selling it to some kid that's going to take it home and beat it with a rock. You know what I mean? Like you didn't vet your customers like, caring breeders do nowadays. I'm sure I don't have to tell you guys, but I turn away a lot more people than get an animal from me. And these days, most of my animals are given away actually than sold, because I know somebody looking for a male this or a female that. And if I bred it and I can help them out, I try to do it. And so most stuff these days is just given away. And I breed for fun now. I don't breed to try to make that next new thing,
Speaking of your female rhinos eating me out of house and home, so
Yeah, we got to get together.
do that. Yeah.
Yeah. I gotta run down there and get it.
Yep, that'll I'll run up to you. So either one works, but
Yeah.
Might have to arrange a trip.
Oh no, a trip to Keith's. Oh damn.
Damn.
Well, he's just 10 minutes from that park. It's no worries.
As a crow flies, not even, right, Rob?
10 minutes.
Yeah,
Car
right?
drive, hour and a half. But
One crazy turn and you're good.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
gosh.
At least I got out of the parking lot alive.
that is true. Yeah.
It was close. It was a close call.
There was a
Yeah.
moment there.
Yeah.
God. Awesome.
So I the one question that we ask a lot of people nowadays is, what's that one piece of equipment in your snake room, that you had? What was that in those days? Like, I mean, maybe you didn't even have a snake room. Maybe it was just in your bedroom or your basement or whatever, but what was that one thing that you had to have in those days?
Believe it or not, it was that stick-on heat pad, man. That was the thing that I thought I was the shit. I thought like people didn't have a clue on how to keep stuff if they only knew about these stick-on heat pads. Like, I was keeping caiman in these 50-gallon aquariums with that slate bottom, and was keeping because before that I would try using fish tank heaters, right? But the caiman would go up against that damn thing and wind up getting a burn on it or something else. So the invention of these stick-on heat pads, I'm telling you, was revolutionary at the time.
And even now, I recommended Eric buy one just this week.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
I'm telling you, they do work for certain species, and for caimans it was ideal because it was warming the water. It wasn't a consolidated heat spot or anything like that,
Yeah.
That and just being able to wire up my own light fixtures so that I could put bulbs in the early days, 25-watt bulb, or if you had to go up to a 60-watt because it was winter time, you would just change the bulb in the cage for the animal just to heat the thing, and you'd cover the top, and there'd be no ventilation, and you'd be overcooking the thing because you didn't even have a thermostat to really take a temperature reading of what was going on in there. You would take your mother's turkey thing that she would jam in the turkey and try to get a reading on the inside, and you'd put that in the cage and try to get a temperature reading. It was pretty barbaric in the early days for sure.
But I mean, that probably means that you have to be that much more tuned in. Well, either it's not going to go well, or you have to be really attuned to the behavior that you're seeing.
Exactly. And I think that's what maybe started helping me look at details and the smallest things, and really try to zone in on what was happening and going on, and why was the animal acting this way, and the animal's acting in a positive way when I do this. So all that stuff, trying to figure it out, I think helped me become the keeper I am today, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Having just those basic things to work with in the beginning.
Yeah, one of the things that go ahead, Owen.
That wasn't me.
That was me. I was going to say, once it was me. I was going to say I was always envious once I learned about people in areas of Texas or Florida that had outside greenhouses or any of this kind of stuff. And when I was growing up, my father was a plant fanatic, and his thing was cactus. He was a tropical fish guy, and he was a cactus guy, and he had this greenhouse. And man, I would beg him for space in that greenhouse all the time, man. I'm like, I'm gonna be like these guys in Florida with this greenhouse, And I did. I kept some species in there, and then when my father's health went bad, and then Teresa and I wound up buying the house, the greenhouse was still there. And you know what I did to that greenhouse? I turned it into one big natural habitat.
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah, it was cool, man. I had a 30 by 12 foot with its own heat and everything else, and I just planted stuff in the ground, and I made a jungle out there, and man, I was in heaven sitting out there. And then we had another kid, and I had to tear it down and put an addition on the house for a bedroom. But it was cool while it lasted, man. I was in heaven while it lasted.
When I was writing up thoughts and questions about the thing, one thing that came to me was that sort of, I guess it's the one takeaway that I always have, learning from you and listening to you is being a better keeper will only make you a better breeder. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. To me, and during this whole time evolving with reptiles, I was also keeping fish and I was also keeping birds. Birds were outside, reptiles were inside. That was great. When the tropical fish thing was there, it started getting a little hairy because I didn't have. I mean, you literally walk through my house and like you could bump into a capuchin monkey or a caiman lizard. I mean, a caiman or there was a loose Amazon parrot flying around or whatever, and and the people, there was a lot of bird people around me, and what they always taught me was it, an animal well when you can breed that animal, raise those babies to adulthood, and then breed those babies. So that was my goal to me, because they're like, you have husbandry down for that animal when you can do that. Now, since then, I've learned that that's not necessarily true, because some animals are very forgiving and you can be keeping them entirely wrong and be breeding the hell out of them. But it doesn't mean that you're really doing the animal justice. It's just that they're able to adapt to our shortcomings. But yeah, in the beginning, for sure, I always felt that was the goal, is if you could breed that animal, then you have a good understanding of that animal, but you have a great understanding of that animal if you can raise those babies and then breed those babies. So that was always definitely a goal, to make me feel that I was doing the animal justice in captivity,
Right. Right.
And that always put up a lot of pressure on me. And I'm sure it put a lot of pressure on you guys growing up too. Like, you'd be in school and I'd be thinking about all these animals I have at home that are depending on me to take care of them. You know what I mean? And when you're that passionate about what you keep, that's a lot of pressure on your shoulders as a kid growing up, because you're just thinking about, man, that boa got mouth rot, or, that other snake has this, and what did I do wrong to create that pain for that animal, and how am I going to fix it? I'd be thinking about that shit in school, not math or something. This stuff. And when I finally shined in school was in biology class in like 6th grade, because I was the only kid that knew what a food chain was. And it was probably the only time in school that I raised my hand to answer a question. It was like the record scratch, and everybody turned around. They're like, "Holy shit, can you answer your question?" And it was about a food chain, and I was like explaining how a field mouse will eat the grass, and then a hawk will see the field mouse and eat the mouse, and then the droppings from the hawk will feed the insects, and they will in turn take care of the grass. And I'm doing this whole thing, and everybody's looking at me, and I look around, and they're all like standing there with their jaws open, like, who the hell is this guy, But for me, I was in heaven, in that class, and I couldn't wait to get to that class every day.
That's so funny. And when I was in 7th grade, the teacher had all these animals in her classroom. She had like a ferret, a couple frogs. She had a snake. She had a turtle. I think she had birds, fish, stuff like that. And it was like, I that's all I wanted to do was go to her class, biology class. And, same thing. Like, oh yeah, I call on me.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the people in the hobby that I'm drawn to, like I'm looking for those other kindred souls, those other passionate people that don't mind being that weird person that has a passion for these animals, and that's who I'm drawn to. There's so many people on there that, looking for animals for the shock value or all, but you find those people that have that true passion. They're like a treasure to me,
Right. Yeah, for sure. Do you know how many species you've bred?
Yeah.
No, I've never put it, including birds, fish, mammals.
Oh my God. No. It's
reptiles.
Yeah, dear God.
Yeah, no, I don't. I never put together a list. I should sometime.
Okay.
I think
what do you think? Is it plus 20?
Yeah, it has to be. I mean, if we sit here and think about it,
20, right?
Short tails, bloods, emeralds,
boas,
boas.
kinks,
I mean, boas, Amazons, and that's just from like
chameleons.
I've known you, San Anzinia, we're already getting like close to 10 anyway if we just sit here and think about it from what we've known you. And then there are shit before that, like, you know, jungle carpets and all this other stuff.
Matamatas.
What?
Well, I can only say I got fertile eggs. I couldn't hatch the eggs. And since then, I've talked to people that goes through, they go through a whole cycle that you have to do to the eggs in order to make them hatch. And I just tried hatching them like any other turtle egg that I've hatched in the past. So I was unsuccessful hatching babies, but I did get fertile eggs from a pair of Matamatas.
That's insane. Wow. That's
cool.
insane. You know, and to have certain species that, again, that like, it must be that the we talk about how the things go into circles with herpetoculture, where, you know, the animals become, there's an overabundance of them and they're all over the place and they become cheap, and then people stop caring about them or keeping them or breeding them, and all of a sudden they become rare again. And to have that circle go round, and then something like a Matamata that, like, there's got to be people out there that are trying like crazy to breed Matamatas and are obsessed with Matamatas and try to find every Matamata they can get to buy. And you're like, oh yeah, I had them, threw them together, got eggs. It's like, what? Like, it's
you know what's really so cool about them? Like, this is the stuff that I love. Like, yeah, they're a really cool looking species, right? Mm-hmm. The Matamata is really cool. But like, I was taking literally like a 2-pound trout and putting that in front of them, and they could inhale that whole 2-pound trout. Like, I had such a different appreciation for those animals when I had them. But did you know when they're stressed that they literally keep shedding like this slimy skin coat when they're stressed out? And I mean, it's like floating around in the water when they're stressed. And I also found out that when you, like, I use these Eheim filters on the tank, and if I had the spray bar underneath the water, everything was cool with these guys. But then I tried raising the spray bar up to create oxygen in the water just to keep the tank healthier. And all of a sudden they shut down, they stopped feeding and everything else. I'm starting to think, why would that stress them out? I'm starting to think, well, the rainy season, the rivers flood in South America. And when it's flooded and those torrent waters are coming through, they probably shut down and, you know, go into survival mode so that they don't get washed away. And, you know, all these things start coming out as you're working with a species. And that's, I think, what I love more even nowadays than being successful in breeding them, is just seeing these little cues in the different things that they do and why they do it. You know what I mean? But the Matamatas were fascinating.
But that's again, like what we talked about earlier, that you can like picture that. I would have just been like, well, the turtles are broken. Like, I wouldn't sit there and be like, well, clearly in the Amazon in this time of the day, this is when the monsoon season happens and this happens. I would have just been like, well, I broke the turtles. Like, and for you to sit there and go that extra step, it kind of points back to what you were talking about earlier, how you only really learned about a species, about how to keep a species by learning about the species in the wild. So I almost feel like herpetoculture needs to kind of get back to that a little bit more, because you seem to have been able to use it towards what you keep and also stuff that you haven't kept before, and just kind of think about it and do what's best for the animal, have a lot of very good success with those animals based off of what you learned about them and what happens in the wild with them. I mean, is that what you kind of think maybe a little bit with that kind of success?
Absolutely. I mean, look at how much, we didn't read it in the book, but look at how much we're going to the Owen and look at how much we learned about Owen doing what we did. You know what I mean? And I think if we could get our hands on them, that would help us be better keepers in that fact, without a doubt. I mean, we probably saved ourselves 2-3 years of husbandry mistakes just by seeing what we saw and experiencing what we experienced, you know? So, one of my without a doubt.
I think it was you, me, and Eric in front of the Owen at Crocosaurus Cove, and the three of us, and there were like, I think, some teenage girls in the room, but the three of us are just, we're just screaming our heads off. It's like, no, that's an arboreal snake. And we're just going nuts because we're looking at it. And we're like, yes. Like, it's just, you can learn those things by looking at it. So like, having that is awesome, or having that mindset, I think, is very good. And, you know, have you used that for certain species that you're keeping now?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Ari's information on Bull and I, they're going to be what is that? They're going to be like my nemesis probably till the day I die, trying to figure out what it is that really is the trigger for being successful with them in captivity. Um, so yeah, I pick Ari's brain as much as I can because he's the only person I know that's gone there as many times as he has and sat in those things and if that area was a little bit better and more Australia like as far as the political climate and all, I would be going with him in a heartbeat there to try to as many times as I could to try to learn about them in the wild and experience what he's experienced to try to put that into what I'm seeing in captivity because they're just so unlike any other python. Everything that I've learned about pythons just doesn't hold true to them, So, I'm not like I said a couple times, I'm not taking anything away from anybody that's been successful, but until you're doing what we said, breeding them consistently, raising babies and breeding the babies, I don't think anybody really has it down yet. It's just an anomaly because there's too many success stories and then that person's never successful again, or they have 5 successes like Frederick. And I'm praying, I'm rooting for him hard this year to do it again, because that's going to give me so much more confidence in myself, even continuing to work with him and hopefully be successful one day. But yeah, those are the ultimate challenge animal. When I got out of the blood pythons in 2013, I wanted the ultimate challenge, and there was nothing in front of me better than the bull and eye python. And boy, they have proved that to be true, But there just seemed to be one animal that I can't seem to put together what that success is. It's one of the species that I just can't get there yet. And I think if I could get into their natural habitat as Ari does, it would be a huge leap forward for me for sure.
You're a
Do you feel
noticeable
that
bloke, man. That I will. I understand your apprehension. Just the hobbits here. That's one thing, but you're distinctive. I think it'll cause some attention for sure.
Yeah, that's what Ari says. He goes, I blend. And I go, Ari, I can't blend. He goes, well, you'll be with me. And I'm like, yeah, but they'll just pull me away from you. And, and I'm like, I'm not as spry as I used to be. I didn't mind getting in a bar fight in my 20s and 30s, but I'm 61 years old now. I'm not getting into any kind of physical altercations to go see a python on a mountain,
Just hire bodyguards. When the fight starts, you point, they go and do it, and then
there you go. There you go. I could probably bring a couple extra grand and actually do that, Owen.
Teresa will pack and hire bodyguards for you.
There you go.
You just tell her what you need, and she'll get it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that would definitely be an adventure of a lifetime too, right there.
Yeah.
Do you feel that like working with that species, the bull and eye, that you're trying to figure out again and sort of like, unlock the mystery of what makes them, that species so distinct from other pythons is sort of like taking you back to those early days of, sort of not having the information and trying to figure it out without.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like I go in that room every day, and every time I look at them, I'm thankful that I have them in my presence to be able to work with. And, I just look at them in awe for sure. And they are the species in the collection down there that, are that species for me for sure. But you guys know I have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I think as I've gotten older and away from the competition of breeding and trying to be the guy with the next new thing and all that kind of stuff, that just going down there and enjoying the animals for what they are is just amazing to me nowadays. And I don't know. I think a lot of keepers as they get older, if they keep the passion, like I'm amazed at some keepers that have gotten out of the hobby that were so iconic to me in the day, like Al Zulich. He still loves the animals. He spends a lot of time going around the country. I've talked to him since he's left the hobby, and he goes around the country trying to find these little obscure zoos where he can see different animals. Like he's still got the passion for the animals, but he doesn't keep a snake anymore. I don't see myself ever doing that. So, right now I'm just enjoying going back and enjoying them for what they are and getting out of the competition of breeding. And, I'll pick a couple species that are in my collection to work with every year to try to get a clutch or a litter out of, and couldn't be happier, man. I'm thrilled to death to do what I'm doing.
Nice. Very cool. I have to ask you about your calico berm. The crazy looking thing you produced. Tell us about that.
So berms back then, they were the ball pythons before the ball pythons were ball pythons, and Bob Clark was the guy back then for sure, having I'm sure whatever was caught in the wild was brought to his attention first, and he got first crack at it, or Tracy did. So, really it was albinos, and greens were just starting to come around, and, the normal berms when I produced that. And, I think there was only 2 other animals at that time around the world that were ever produced, and they were all females, and nobody knew if it was genetic or anything. And Tracy right away sent me a male that she had that literally just had 2 black scales on it, but she thought, hey, let's give it a shot to that calico. And I tried breeding it out, and it never produced. But Tracy, I had gotten an albino from Tracy. And when I produced that out of that albino, Tracy said that albino came from this male that had this black speck on it. So maybe it is a genetic thing. So that's why we tried breeding her back to that male, but it never did prove out to be a genetic thing. But yeah, when that was probably the first time that I did do what I condemn nowadays, with a lot of massive cutting of the egg so I could see what was inside, and Tracy was like, I was on the phone with her, and I'm telling her that this thing's really wild. It's totally different. And she's like, get it out of the egg, get out of the egg, and then I had to take a picture. I had to download it onto the computer, and then, forward it to her. And about, an hour and a half later, when she was able to finally see what the picture was, she was blown away. She couldn't believe that thing. And then that animal subsequently got onto Dr. Bechtel's cover of his book, and it made it in a couple other books. And I'm like blown away that, people are coming up to me in shows and looking at that and saying, hey, do you mind if I put this in a book? I'm like, hell yeah, man. That's cool shit. Go ahead, go for it, But it was pretty cool having a snake that there was only like 2 other animals that looked like it in the world at the time,
Sure.
So yeah, that was, it was weird. There was a couple people that said, Keith, you're this strange guy. Like, nobody hears from you or anything else. And then every couple of years you come to the show and you just blow everybody away with something really weird. And everybody thought I had like some radon in my basement or some kind of crazy thing that, every once in a while, just something crazy would happen to me. And it was just fortunate luck, that these different things started popping up in breedings that I was doing. And, yeah, it's just real lucky back then, I guess. I don't know.
So just because this isn't an audio or isn't a visual medium, I think the best way to describe it, right, is at this point we'd call it a paradox rather than a calico in terms of the impression that it creates. And the funny thing is, right, there are now 2 different proven mutations where that paradox look is actually inheritable, whereas if you go back to Eric Sandoval with the ball pythons that are albino ball pythons that are the same and all this stuff, that is kind of the same experience as yours, where it's conceived of as not being genetic. And then the paradox albino Kenyan Samboa, right, is genetic.
Right.
Obviously the banana / coral. I was trying to think what's the other name for that. Coral glow ball python, right? It's this hypo or T positive albino looking snake with black, black on it. But those are genetic. So it's it's very interesting that I don't know. To me, and maybe you could speak to this, Keith, both with the short tails and all, just sort of the history of herpetoculture, is that we had this conception of things, your animals, and then the Eric Sandoval albino ball python, paradox albino ball pythons and stuff that actually wound up not being genetic. And then there are down the road, it's proven that there can be. And in the same way, there were dozens of ball pythons that weren't genetic, and then it turned out, just this little funky belly thing that actually is, and it makes a white snake. It's crazy.
Right.
It's right. And then I guess to me, the thing I always find so fascinating about this sort of idea is that we view knowledge through the lens that we have today generally, and we apply that retroactively and say, oh, this guy in 1995 was lying because he said he thought it was this. And it's like, no, you have to take
That's what he
yourself
thought.
back
Yeah.
to view it. How would I view it in the absence of this knowledge? We view so much stuff with hindsight is 2020 and say like, oh, that wasn't a thing and they knew it. And it's no, you learn stuff and you need to put yourself in the shoes of 20 years ago to actually make that call.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's sort of the idea of the show, right? Because I think that it's almost impossible for young people to imagine the world without the internet or an iPhone or, you know, any of these things that today, or Facebook or social media or YouTube, or, you know what I mean? Like information is just at the,
it's only going to get worse. Soon we will understand why we did.
To Rob's point, so that ghost line animal that, you know, started it all, I actually was an imported wild animal from Kevin McCurley had it, and he was at this little local show in New York State. And I mean, like 10 people went to this show and he was not selling anything. And I had jungle carpet litter at the time. And I went up to his table and he had this, he was calling it a hypo Borneo short tail. Well, actually Borneo blood python back then. And I said to Kevin, I said, hey, would you trade these, I don't know, 5 or 6 jungle carpets for that Borneo? And he's like, sure. Because he wasn't making any sales that day or anything. And I'm sure he thought, you know, these jungles he could get some more money for than he was going to get for this for this short tail that, you know, nobody was going to take a second look at. He was calling it a hypo. And that's how I got that animal. So to Rob's point, when I was breeding that, I was breeding for different looks because I could see different looks, but there was no way to put a label on that animal except for a name. And nowadays people look back at, you know, these different names that I put on them, like the Crystal Glow or this or the Cinnamon, but it was to describe a look that I was breeding for. And people get hung up on that now today. Like Matt was in his battle with this guy and trying to explain to him why I name things now. And like Rob saying, hindsight's 2020. I was just trying to describe that, hey, if you want a cinnamon ghost from me, ask for a cinnamon ghost and I'll give you an animal that looks this way. If you want an animal that looks like what I'm calling a crystal glow, ask for a crystal glow and I'll give you pictures of that animal, because there was no other way for me to describe it. But people get hung up on that and think that animal's going to breed true and produce more and all that kind of stuff. But it was a line bred animal, and you could lose that trait within one generation of breeding if you weren't savvy to Borneos and how to perpetuate that look down the road. And nowadays, like, I get crucified for it if it comes up. Like, why would you name that thing that when it's not a true morph and doesn't breed true?
That's what
they
drives
can't comprehend.
Crazy. It drives me crazy,
you know?
when I see that stuff.
Yeah. You know, they're talking from 20 years ago when that was the only way I could describe that animal to another person that was looking for an animal that looked that way, you know? So I put these labels on these different looks.
Yeah,
I get a kind of a kick out of it now, but it does drive you crazy. You know?
I guess I just suggest, right, that we should be a little more open-minded and like not assume ill intent on the part of everyone 25 years ago.
Well, listen, Don Hamper, you, Rob, know Don Hamper better than anybody, and Eric, I'm sure you guys know Don Hamper.
Yeah.
God rest his soul, rest in peace. I thought he was a great person, and he definitely was. I consider a mentor for me. And, you know, Don has a little bit of a sense of humor. And I can remember him going to a show and putting some kind of a label on some Sumatran short tails that he had, you know, like some crazy. And I can remember, like, in these blood python groups, they were crucifying. They all took pictures and couldn't wait to get in this group and crucify Don Hamper for calling it, you know, like, I forget what he called it, an ebony black blood or some kind of a crazy name on it, and it was more of a joke for Don, but these blood python people were like tearing him apart. And I'm like, dude, it's Don Hamper. Cut him a break. He's trying to be funny at a show. You know what I mean?
Right. Open up your Dick Ross book, as we've been talking. I'm so excited.
Exactly.
Open that up, and it's like, oh, who was the first private person to breed Timor or Lesser Sundus pythons? It's pictured in the book. Oh, take a look at the credit, and then maybe reevaluate your situation.
Yeah. And the lack of respect for the pioneers, because they didn't do the research to know who these people were. That's why this show, Eric, I hope you continue with and get some of these real legends in the hobby on the show. So maybe it opens people's eyes to what came before them and what got them to where they are today, and maybe have a little respect for these people instead of, trying to look for, I posted a picture of 2 of my green Sanzinia breeding in a Sanzinia group, and right away, guys like hybrid. Like, what? Yeah.
Explain. Go on. It's just
and Paul, and Jeff Murray, got a good chuckle out of it, and Paul kind of set the person straight, but it just seems like, everybody's looking to try to belittle somebody else to increase their status in the hobby today. It definitely drives you a little nuts,
Well, what drives me insane is that there are people that do it to people, and rather than realize that they don't know what they're talking about and apologizing and back up, they double down. And to argue with somebody like you, who's been at the forefront of a lot of different species, shut up. Just shut the hell up. You don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And that's when you want to kind of lose your cool, right. And but I always try to take the higher road, I mean, I have no idea. Tracy Barker, Eugene Bissett, and a couple other people told me I was the first private person to ever breed green Sanzinia and Mandarin Sanzinia in captivity. And, and then I have this guy that I've never even heard of before, and he's calling the snakes that I'm posting hybrids. It just it was kind of mind blowing.
It doesn't make any sense. It's almost like there are people who hide behind keyboards who are so adamant that what they believe is the truth that they're going to rain on your parade, and then when they're proven wrong, they just disappear. And
but they're in the long run, they're hurting themselves, right? Because they're setting a tone for themselves that nobody with experience is going to help them. Man, I'd rather just shut up and sit in a room and listen to everybody else talk and pick up any bits of information I can that I think will be useful to me, instead of trying to act like the person that knows everything, and nobody's going to talk to you in a way that you learn stuff from. You learn from everybody, man.
And that's something I can definitely appreciate, because when you were at Eric's and you were picking out your gelatins, you were like, Owen, I like these 2. What do you think? Because it's like you wanted another opinion from somebody who's seen carpet python babies.
That's what I'm saying. You guys eat, drink, sleep. When you, Rob, and Eric start talking carpet pythons, I just sit there, smile, and nod.
Right,
trying to follow along with the conversation. So when I have the ability to pick your brains on what things to look for a species that you guys know far better than I do, I'm going to take advantage of that. I'm not going to tell you sit there and pretend I know what I'm looking at when I can ask you guys that I know what you're looking at,
But that's the thing, is and that's what you can appreciate, is because you know where your expertise are. If you ever see me with an emerald, take it from me. I don't know what I'm doing with it. Okay. Don't even just take it away. But you also recognize where there could be other input from other people that you can appreciate. So you request it and you seek it out. And that's what I think is definitely lacking with a lot of herpetoculture, is that everybody seems to be that they are the expert, and they cannot bring in new information, which is stupid. Right. So
a lot of egos run rampant in the hobby. That's unfortunate, but I guess that's anywhere in life.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's kind of an old school mentality in itself, right, Keith? To just approach things and say, okay, every potential person that I interact with, I could possibly learn something from. Right. And I'm going to give respect to
Absolutely.
people that have done it before. Inherently, I'm going to do that. And then everyone is a potential source of knowledge. And it's just a different approach. Fundamentally, it's a different approach.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So this is Dennis McNamara, and I am going to tell you how Keith Mcpeek influenced me over the years. So it started in the mid-'90s, maybe late '90s, when I was a kid and would stand in front of his table for what felt like hours on end, gawking at his marble short tails and Tanzania and things. I did that at multiple Orlando shows, into Mars and Baltimore, and probably into Daytona. Then that ended up going into where I can ask him questions. He was just accessible, and we would get on AOL Messenger back in the day. And those are the days before he knew how to write novels on Facebook. So he would have his wife type for him so we could actually do some messaging back and forth. And we'd chat all the time when I saw Python Man 1 arrive on AOL. And then just one more thing about his, I don't know, greatness, I guess would be the way to say it, is I bought my first pair of high-end blood pythons from him. Spent a good chunk of change on the first head albinos that I could afford. Raised them up, bred them, and then my first female I ever had that went egg bound. She laid a couple eggs and then didn't pass the rest. She survived and was okay, but I called him and asked him about it. Next time I saw him, he gave me a yearling female just to make it better. He didn't have to do that, but just that's the kind of guy he is. Just a wonderful guy all around. Proud to call him a friend now. Hopefully I didn't bug him too much when I was younger, but he's just a great guy, influenced me in lots of ways, and someone I definitely look up to.
Yeah, I often enjoy a lot of times when new people will ask me questions that maybe I never thought about, carpet python related, let's just say. And, it's like, they'll ask me a question and I'll be like, I don't really know that. And like next thing I know, they're asking me a question, but I'm actually learning from them, because I'm going to start asking them questions. And now, I never looked at it that way before. Oh, okay. That's interesting, and like, and I don't know. I think that, you can always learn. You can always learn more, except you with short tails, which what led you to want to work? I mean, to me, that's sort of like, would you say that's what you're most well known for, is short tails? I that would be my guess, but
I would say at a time for sure, but I go on the blood python groups now and I'll comment or something, and somebody will come back with like, who the hell is this guy?
And that's insane to me, because they're breeding animals. Like watch it be some guy who's totally in love with the animals that you like, your line you started.
Well, yeah, no, I'll see somebody talking about marbles, and then I'll comment on it and they'll be like, okay, thanks. And I'm like, no, dude, I created those, I swear I know something about them. I swear.
It almost seems like you have like this perfect setup for that, because it's like you sort of like ran with this football, and then it seems like you sort of passed it off to Matt, and now Matt's sort of like running with that football.
Oh yeah, Matt's taking off with it for sure. Matt is going places where I only dreamed to on some of the, the looks that I was going for. Matt has taken him to that level. So the books that I got to look at, and you would see this short, fat python, unlike any other python. That's what made me want to have them, because, I love gaboon vipers, just the style of them, how they hunt, that they're one of the few, we were talking about this with Scott the other day, one of the few venomous snakes that actually take down larger prey. Everything about a gaboon is awesome. And to me, a blood python and a short tail were that in the python clan, so I was always drawn to them from day one, but getting your hands on one was like insane. I can remember red wild import bloods coming in, and they were like $1,000 a piece, and
Jesus.
Rob, did you know the Hudaks up in Rochester, New York?
Only
they started
yeah.
Yeah, they started. I don't know if they were trying to be competition to Cam over there or whatever, but they were, starting some stuff. And I can remember getting some wild import red bloods from them. And when I first saw like an adult red blood python, a wild red blood python, and you're dealing with this unruly, 25-pound animal that when it strikes at you, the whole animal comes up off the ground. And it's lightning fast, and there's no indication that the strike is coming. And if
Just
it does
the
connect, it's
right?
like it's like getting hit with, a bat with spikes on it, because of the impact and the force of the blow. Like, I like animals with an edge. I like animals that command respect. I like to give them that respect. I like to have them, me forcing me to meet them on their terms. That's something I always had. That's why I think seeing animals in top hats or a bear riding a bicycle, it just drives me nuts, because to me that's so disrespectful to that animal and the evolution of that animal and why it became where it was and all that kind of stuff. I know I'm taking it way too seriously, but that's just me, in my opinion. It just drives me nuts. But blood pythons were just built so unlike anything else. That's why I had to have them. And from day one, when I got the first little wild imports and we're growing them up, I just envisioned seeing that head coming out of an egg. And I was like, one day I will see that head coming out of an egg, and it's going to be the most amazing thing. And I can remember when it was actually red bloods were the first of that clan that I bred. I can remember I actually came home from work because I was sure this female was going to lay eggs. And I came home from work and I called my boss and I'm like, I'm staying home. I think my steak's going to lay eggs. And he's like, what? And I'm like, I got to stay home. I swear I'll make it up on Saturday, but I'm staying home. My steak's going to lay eggs. And he just could not fathom it, but he was cool and he let me stay home. And I just sat there for hours and hours and hours. And when I first saw that first egg coming out of that snake, and I'm like, man, I did it. I got these eggs, and you could see it was a good egg and everything else. And then getting that bait, I was hooked. I mean, that was it. I was like, I got to get rid of everything else. And I'm just going to get like as many of these things and as many different looks that I can find. And this is going to be my thing. And I just started weeding out anything else I had. And eventually that's all I was working with is, I had every size here, multiple, of each sex, and just, everywhere you looked was just nothing but blood pythons from floor to ceiling. And yeah, man, you get to know an animal really good like that, I mean, ideally, if Bull and I were $300 and all over the place, that's what I would do. They would still hold that magic to me, whether they were $300 and readily available or 10 grand and you can't find them anywhere. I would love to be able to fill that room with Bull and I and really finally try to figure it out, and I think really that's what you need to do to really figure it out. But yeah, at that time, bloods were that for me, man. They were that rare, that hard to breed. And, it was that big of an accomplishment back in the day. Just getting wild imports to feed and stay alive was huge, So, yeah, man, I was hooked from day one. Once I got them, that was it. I knew that was the species for me.
Nice.
Wow.
How difficult was it to find, and where did you find, acquire new animals?
It was imports, man. Luckily, still the craze still hadn't really gone crazy yet. So, if somebody got something a little unusual and they knew that I was a blood python guy, they would mail you a picture or, download it and send it to you via computer to get a picture of the blood python that they had. And, I did befriend a couple guys in Indonesia. And they would kind of put me on a lead if something was coming into the country. And, I just tried to just buy as much stuff as I could. But, I found that the bigger players like Tracy and all that would drop 10 grand on an animal were getting the really cool stuff. So I started gravitating more and more to the Borneos because a lot of people were more into the bloods. And I found that, I could pick up just little looks on those animals and sure enough, breed for that trait a lot like, fish aquarium, guys in the fish hobby do, and, breed for different traits that I really liked in them. And it was something that I was kind of good at. So, you start having success with something and you start getting deeper and deeper into it. And I was hooked for a long time on that game and that mindset of just trying to get to that next level and that next animal that looked like something that nobody else had. And, for quite a few years, that was what drove me in the hobby. And one day it just all ended, it was like a light switch. It was really strange for me, but I was like, man, I can't do this anymore. And I think a lot of it had to do with, more and more people getting into it and the competition. I've never been a real competitive guy.
Right.
I was always like an athletic guy, but I hated sports because the competition, like I'm just not a competitive guy, and when it started getting competitive and people were like, I produced this and I produced that, all of a sudden that mystique about the animal and all that kind of stuff just went away in a flash for me. And it was just like I knew the time was right for me to get out and maybe go back. And that's when, Bull and I started catching my eye a lot more. And I was like, man, if I sell all these different animals, I could put together a nice little group of Bull and I. And, 2013, that was it. The switch went off and I was done with them. It was kind of strange when I look back at it now, but it was just like, boom, one day, and that was it.
Wow.
At the same time, you doing that was an opportunity for a bunch of other people. I know my Matt and my's buddy, Chris Kopecki, I would get calls from him every week when you were getting out saying, this is unreal, man. The opportunity to work with these awesome, fantastic animals, all this stuff. So the excitement that you were able to push forward, even by you taking a step back, unreal.
Yeah. 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 I really didn't know that was going on. I know, Mark Kirkpatrick down in Florida was real happy to get some animals, and Chris got some animals. And, I tried to get animals in different people's hands that were really good to the animals at the time that I was getting out, and I had befriended, through Facebook and through forums and whatnot. I tried to get as many of my animals into those people's hands instead of strangers that I could, whether they could afford them or not. I tried to get them in their hands no matter what, just because I wanted to see them there, even though I was trying to generate money for the Bull and I wanted those animals to go in just certain people's hands,
Right. Right.
I'm so like proud of Matt because, I know Matt since he was, picking up his first short tails and his first bloods. And, so I've watched him grow in the hobby, and to see him, like you say, pick that ball up and run with it and, score more than one or two touchdowns for sure. I mean, my God, the stuff he's doing with marbles, the extreme stuff he's creating is like what I only envisioned in my head, and he got there, man. So I'm so proud of him. I'm glad that he's such a good friend and family to me, that, that it was him that was able to get that look to that point. As much as I'm not into morphs anymore these days, I look at that stuff and I'm just, I get a chill in my spine because I know what went into getting there, and
Sure.
He put a lot of work and a lot of talent to get there. So yeah, man, I still appreciate that stuff beyond belief. It's just not my game anymore, but I still appreciate it,
I think the polygenic stuff is entirely different. It's kind of like, it's just not replicable in the same way. And it's like,
right.
I'm not a morph guy either, but at the same time, you see that polygenic stuff that someone's really pushing forward. It's like, okay, I can certainly appreciate that. Everyone likes a beautiful critter. If you can have one they're all awesome, but if you can have one that looks exceptionally beautiful and you're actually kind of making that happen, all props to you. That's just fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
What were some of the projects that you were working on? Just, the names of them. I know I'm glad we sort of talked about, naming them, and also people sort of have an understanding of that, but like, what were some of the lines that you're...
Well, that ghost thing unlocked so many different things for me. And, so I had the ghost, I had a crystal glow, leopard, and I had a tiger and I had the blues. I had the cinnamons, and they were all, except for the ghost and the marble, those will breed true. The other ones are line bred traits, just from selective breeding to intensify certain looks. And with Borneos, if you have blue in the background in the bloodline, it can crop up at any place. If you breed two blues, you have a very good chance of getting babies in that litter that are blues, but you're also going to get animals that look more like, Crystal Glow or whatever else. So I actually destroyed the marble line in my collection because I bred it into the ghost line thinking I was going to create something totally different, maybe more faded out with more speckling, but it actually did the opposite. And it created really cool patterns in the animals that carried the two traits, but it didn't enhance the marbling like what Matt was able to achieve. He kept his line in a different direction. Thank God he did, because I basically destroyed the marble line here to get to where Matt did because I bred it into the blue line and then, kept accentuating, trying to get that line going. Eventually, all my marbles had the blue line and the ghost line in it. So I was not able to even come close ever to achieving what Matt's achieved by him keeping it pure and outcrossing it to the different animals he did to keep expanding on that. So that was kind of a cool path that I took, but a very cool path that Matt stuck with and took it to where he did.
That's awesome.
So what was your biggest accomplishment that you had with short tails? What was the thing that stands out for you personally?
I guess I would have to say the marble, because the name is still used very prominently today. So, there's animals that stick out in my head. I had one. We were in Florida, and there was a ride called the Simulator, and Teresa accidentally called it the Stimulator. And I'm like, Teresa, it's not the Stimulator. It's called the Simulator. But anyway, at that time, I had bred this really cool looking genetic super striped cross to a marble animal that I couldn't put a name on, and we nicknamed it the Stimulator. So we were in Daytona, and we had it called the Stimulator. But that was actually probably one of my favorite Borneos that I ever produced. And I think Mark Kirkpatrick wound up with that animal. And then, I produced another animal that, Rob, you probably remember, maybe it had that head stamp on it, very like a paradox animal. And that Borneo stands out to me as a very cool animal. And then there was one I call the Super Ghost, because it hardly had any pattern as a baby. It was almost an all-white snake, and it faded out to this silver. Those three animals for sure probably stand out to me as some of the coolest Borneos that I ever produced.
Awesome.
That's
Very
awesome.
Cool.
Were there any ones that you did produce that you thought were going to go like in one direction and either made a complete left turn into a different direction or went nowhere?
No, I was pretty fortunate. Like, just being that I raised so many of those animals, like I had a pretty good handle on where they were going to go and what they were going to do, and I had the eye for putting them together and getting to where I wanted to go. I was very surprised in Daytona. Rob, you could probably remember. Everybody would call them the Asian cartel. They would come in their business suits and a briefcase full of money, cash, and they loved the short tails, boy. And when you saw them coming for your table, there was going to be animals flying off of your table. And my goal, I guess, always was for Daytona show to bring animals that they would like. So
100%. It's like you'd write out a receipt and be like, I don't know what this is going to do for you relative to import-export paperwork.
And somehow they got them out of the country, though.
Yeah.
I'll take it.
Yep.
Yeah,
but no, I was fortunate with them. I guess one of the biggest surprises to me, Owen, was that the animals that carry the genetics for super stripe actually I liked more, and I didn't realize that they would have this. If you took a fisherman's net and draped it over a snake, that's kind of the pattern they would have, this very obscure squiggly lines all over their body. And those guys were always a surprise on what they would look like. So I always liked breeding super stripes, not together, because I was trying to create animals with that pattern. So those guys were very definitely something that I didn't know what was going to come out, and always very excited to see what was going to come out of the egg because they had such unusual patterns.
That's awesome.
Very cool. What keeps you engaged today, now, currently in reptiles?
Honestly, I've been able to capture that feeling again that I had when I was a kid. You know, like I'm in awe of all these nature shows that I'm finding on these Discovery Plus channels and everything. And like Rob hooked me up with this guy that gave me the most unbelievable bull snakes. Now, you would think somebody that has been doing it as long as I have and has had the different species that I've had would not be blown away by a pair of bull snakes, right? But I am as blown away today at those bull snakes as I was as a kid when I did find my first black rat snake in a while. I don't know what it is, but I guess as you get older, your perspective on life and everything around you, and you appreciate things so much more. It's just able me to capture that awe of reptiles that I had as a kid. You know, everything to me is as fascinating today as when I was 10 years old. So I don't know. It's just a true passion. I don't think I will ever lose, and I'm hoping that I never lose it for sure. Like I say, some of the people in the hobby that have faded away, I just don't understand it. I'm 61 now, and I'm still as in awe of anything that I see reptilian as I was from the day one. So I think I'm just very fortunate to still have that outlook on looking at the animals and still being in awe of them and still wanting that next thing that I haven't kept yet, you know?
That was going to be my next question. Is there still something that is out there?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't know. Rob might think I'm crazy, but man, I would love to have some of those Borneo earless monitors, man. Those things are so cool. I would love to have, like, you know, you guys know I'm into fish too, you know, and I got
Sure.
the one tank now and all. But there's something, you know, creating a fish tank is like, Eric, kind of what you're doing with the monitors now, or that Owen did with his rhinos, and you know, you can create a real natural habitat for the species, you know, and I love that about the earless monitors. Like, you know, they have them set up in these like shallow, you know, very rocky, naturalistic setups. The way a lot of guys are keeping them, and you know, I'm really starting to dig that again too. Like, you know, less is more maybe, and, you know, start getting these bigger, more naturalistic setups for certain species that do well in them. Some species in captivity don't actually do well that way. Like, you know, blood pythons are a perfect example. They don't really thrive in a setup like that, like they do in a more basic cage. But there are species that do thrive in those, and that's starting to really turn me on. So yeah, those guys have been on my radar a little bit, and hopefully they become available for sure. And you know, having Gavin for a friend, how can you not want to have Owen Pelly Python on your radar as still a possibility in my lifetime of making it to the States, and you know, hopefully being able to acquire some babies at some point. I've never worked with what you guys are working with. I'm so jealous that you guys got the rough scale pythons. I mean, that was something I never thought in my lifetime. That was the rarest species of python at one time that you never thought. I never thought in a million years anybody would be working with those in the States, you know? And, you know, that's one I would definitely like to have too at some point. So yeah, man, there's still a lot of species out there to go for.
Very cool. Very cool.
I love it, man. And without getting into the industrialization of Borneo and all those things, to point out how the Lanthanotus have become, why they're, you know, we're cropping up in greater numbers. It's I know you'll remember from the 90s, they went to Cincinnati Zoo, that the ones that were found, it was like, oh, they found it because they were digging a latrine. You're
Right.
talking about a subterranean critter that was only discovered because of this, which speaks to maybe how they're finding them now. And as I say, it's best to avoid that. But I think it's fantastic, man. I think you are getting into more the elaborate setups and all that stuff, and I really love what you're doing. And it's so much respect for all the things that you're doing. That you've the progression, right? The evolution of the process, and I love where you're going.
I appreciate that, Robin. I got to tell you, man, I learned a lot by going to your collection and viewing how you do things. There was in just that brief time when you were preparing all your animals for us to go to Australia, because you'd be gone for a while, and watching how you do things, man, I learned a lot from that. I love the way you have that cork bark in those cages, and it makes so much sense the way you have it in that cage to get that animal to be able to do what it does, seeing how another keeper does stuff that's successful with those animals, man, that to me would be another step that I would like to take, is traveling around to people I've befriended and getting to see how they do things and spending a couple hours in their collection. I mean, there's a lot of people across this country doing different things that we know well. And that to me is something I'm looking forward to maybe start doing once this pandemic is over with and we're able to travel and, see people a little bit more easily. But man, I learned a lot at your collection, in just that brief time that we were there.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean, it's a reflection of your stuff, and it's a reflection, frankly, of, going back to Frank, right? And saying, okay, this is keeping snakes as monitors, basically.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And applying it to a totally different species.
Yeah. Very cool.
So, Keith, are you building Owen Pelly Python enclosures in the hope that one day they'll be here soon? I mean, is that what we're doing? Wishful thinking? I mean,
yeah. So it consists of a room that's about 40 feet tall, and there's this one rock outcrop that comes way out, and then a tree about 5 feet away from it.
Right. And your Teresa's bed is underneath that, right?
And I'm just going to lay on the floor of that cage looking up all the time.
Perfect. I approve.
Think of that picture that Gavin has as his what do you call that? That his thing is on Facebook of him
his avatar.
With his avatar. Oh my God, that is one hell of a snake, isn't it?
Yes, I love it.
See, when we were seeing stuff and all, like, you're like, man, there's no way these things are tackling a rock wallaby or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, they're just like a Amazon tree boa on steroids. But then Gavin sends me that picture and I'm like, oh my God, that thing could definitely handle a wallaby,
Yeah. No doubt.
Now it makes sense.
Yeah.
That was the picture, Owen, we saw when we were getting a picture for the croc. Remember, he had that big, picture of Gavin with the Owen Pelly and the thing when you were asking us if we wanted to take our picture and the tube of death or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Whatever you call it.
Yeah. I forget what I said, but it was something bad. But yeah, it was the cage of death or the tube of mild disappointment.
Cage of death.
Yeah, that was it.
Mild disappointment. I like it.
Yeah. They didn't lower us in the nesting mother's cage. They went to this fat one over here. I'm like, oh, yeah, don't want to have a real show. But anyway, that's the kind of stuff I like to think about, is stuff that maybe isn't necessarily within arm's length, but will soon get here. I mean, do you think that, like, you're just going to keep rolling with it? And if Owen Pellies were to eventually become available, that you jump all over them?
Yeah, I mean, I may be using a cane instead of a snake hook to deal with them at that point, but I'm willing to go for it if I can.
I'll give Keith on his rascal scooter coming to get his own belly pythons. Yeah.
I don't know if you've noticed me bragging about, especially, I mean, all my grandkids, but my one grandson, Colt, he is definitely seems to be, my daughter always calls him a mini Keith. You know, he's just like kind of following in my footsteps with nature and his wonderment at looking at things. And I mean, she sent me pictures of him looking at this praying mantis, and she's like, oh my God, it's such a little you know? So I have hopes that one day when I'm old and feeble in a wheelchair, Colt will be carrying on the traditions, and I'll be, you know, able to still be in the hobby through his hands and eyes, you know?
Nice.
That'd be cool.
Because, you know, Eric, you may be 60 one day and hiking through Australia, you know?
Well, if I make it to 60, I will be 60 hiking through Australia. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
I unfortunately will be dead by a horrible crocodile accident in a couple of years, so I don't think I'm going to make it to 60.
You know,
So,
I'm going to give
We
you
do it again.
I'm going to give you a little tip, right? So I sort of took this from Rob, like he listens to this Hiking Australia podcast, right? And I started listening to it, and I like to watch, I don't know what it is, but for me, I like to watch like people in nature, right? Like they go into nature and they go there for a couple days and they live off the land and all this stuff and they fish and whatnot. But I watch it for people in North America, and I said, I wonder if they have this for people in Australia. So I looked it up. I'm telling you, man, you will see footage of Australia like you've never seen on the hiking YouTube channels, Hiking Australia.
Really?
There's this guy I watched today. He's in this like this canoe, and he's canoeing through this park in Sydney. And man, I'm just so jealous watching it. That's my little tip for you guys. You know, you can take
I'll
that.
have to check it out.
I'll have to send you some links and stuff. But like, man, it's just it's just so
please don't retire to Australia, Eric. Please, I don't know what I'll do. You can't leave me and go to Australia. You understand?
Well, you
guys
to stay, you know.
You guys know I scroll through TikTok looking for animal stuff because I'll send it to you guys when I find something cool, you know. Yeah. And I found this one of a guy, and he's reeling in, and all of a sudden this croc comes up that he had snagged, you know. So I'm like, oh, I got to send this to Gavin because me and Gavin both love to fish, you know. So I figured he'd be like, holy shit, you know. I sent it to him. He goes, yeah, that happens all the time over here. And I'm like, what? He's like, you just shake him off a little bit. It's no big deal. And meanwhile, I'm like thinking that I found something that he's going to be blown away by, you know. He's like, that happens all the time.
You shake them off. It's a saltwater crocodile. Like, no.
This is the epitome of the OP brothers, right? Is that Keith is our connection to Gen Z with the TikTok and always text messages.
Yeah.
Well,
yes.
I don't know he sent it to me. I don't know if he sent it to you guys or whatever, but I don't know if he sent it me in a text message or whatever. But you know that Rob, you would know better than I do. But you know that little like mangrove that we went through where we walked across that metal. What was that?
That was like the first day we got there, I think.
Yeah, that was that whole
off the Darwin City Center. Yeah. Point Harbor and all that.
So Keith sends me a video of it, but now it's filled with water and there's crocs at the end of it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, they're walking through and there's like
Don't worry about that.
Foot of water on the bridge that we walked on.
I remember that part where it was all like it was like a gully right before we got to like the mangroves and stuff like that. That was that's awesome.
We conspicuously went at low tide, guys. I mean, I know you think that. I mean, and I mostly do just wander into stuff accidentally, but you know, it's not entirely for nothing.
Oh, does that bridge actually get submerged at high tide?
Yeah.
100%. Oh, okay.
Oh, I thought
they were walking at high tide.
Yeah,
I plan these things to keep you idiots alive. Will you please just trust me? All right.
Right. I mean, there is a half a modicum of thought that goes into this stuff, man.
Oh, there's no doubt. I know you think about that night and day, man.
Absolutely.
You would be lost in the sauce without you on their trips.
I do. I'm glad you do because I don't, and it really helps. So
yeah, dude, there's nothing better than sitting on a plane for 14 hours just thinking to yourself, I wonder what Rob's got planned for us. That's freaking awesome.
Good stuff. I don't know. I guess what we'll close out with, Keith, is one of your craziest reptile stories. I don't know. Whatever. You pick it. You say it.
Do it.
Oh, damn, dude. I have no idea. Craziest reptile story. Well, the craziest, I mean, if you want to go for doing something stupid, I could tell you the story again about me with my big Burmese pythons when I was feeding rabbits that night when I was supposed to be making a water baby bottle for Jessica. So,
Yes.
so, basically, Jesse's a little baby. We have all these, 18-foot Burmese pythons downstairs, and I had thawed out a bunch of rabbits to feed the collection. And it's time for Jesse's feeding at night. And while I'm making her bottle, I remembered, holy shit, I never fed off those couple rabbits that were downstairs to those berms. So while the bottle's heating, I'll go downstairs and just, throw them in the cages and be back up before the bottle's done. Well, I go down there, and of course, the water's boiling and the thing's probably melting in the pot, and all. And Teresa gets up, and she's like, "Where the hell is he?" And I'm downstairs. She comes downstairs to find me. What I had done was open the door, half asleep, thinking about the baby bottle, going to feed Jessica, and I take this rabbit and I throw it in there to the berm, but the berm sees my hand move, smells the rabbits that were in there, and she tags my hand instead of the rabbit, of course. So she's like 18 feet, and she's at about chest level for me. So my first thought is get her out of the cage and get her on the ground because she's going to wrap me up. So I get her on the ground. She does wrap me up. She wraps up my legs, my two hands, because I'm holding her head and she's got my hand in her mouth. Now I'm officially hogtied. I'm bent over. She's got my legs wrapped up, my hands wrapped up, and I'm just sitting there like, what the hell am I going to do? If I call my wife, I'm going to be in worse trouble than I am with this snake. So Teresa's pissed off because she's wondering where I am. I'm not feeding the baby. So she says he's got to be downstairs. She comes down, opens the door, and she's like, what the hell are you doing? I'm literally wrapped up by this giant, Burmese python, and I'm supposed to be feeding the baby. So she's like, what do I do? And I'm like, you just grab the tail and start walking around me and unwind this thing from me, and we'll get her back in the cage. So me and her downstairs, and she didn't shut off the damn bottle that was being heated upstairs either. So, she finally gets the thing off me. We wrangle her back up in the cage. I still got her head. She still got my hand. And I'm just sitting there real quietly. And finally she starts letting go. But every time I move, she clamps back down. Well, she finally does start letting go. And I get my hand out of there and I release her. And she immediately just goes to eat the rabbit. But I'm looking at my hand that's pretty mangled now from being in this berm mouth with us trying to wrestle her back into the cage and, contorting on my hand and everything else. So now it's like midnight. We're like, what are we going to do now? Because you're bleeding pretty good and you don't want to go to the hospital because they'll come take your baby away from you. You crazy guy with these 18-foot snakes in your house and little baby. So we're like, yeah, we can't go to the hospital. So she goes, knocks on the neighbor's door at 12 in the morning. She's like, do you mind coming over? Keith had an accident. So she has no idea what's going on, so we have to tell her about the story of the snakes. She was a doctor and she worked in a doctor's office, I should say. So she put some butterflies on me and soaked my hand and cleaned me all up and got me all back to work. But I couldn't use that hand for about a week. But moral of the story is that a baby bottle in boiling water does not last a plastic baby bottle through wrestling an 18-foot Burmese python. It tends to melt and shrivel up on the bottom of the pot.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So yeah, that was a good night. And that was the decision that actually made us decide to get out of anything that was that big, so that also made us downsize to something a little more manageable in the house.
Gotcha.
Jesse got fed around 1 o'clock in the morning, something like that is what we're thinking.
Yeah. So, speaking of Jesse and Burmese pythons, the calico berm or the paradox, as Rob's saying, we were going to take a photo for a magazine at my house and the photographer's there. And he's like, why don't you put the kid, your daughter next to you while you're holding the snake? So Jesse comes walking over and spooks the berm and the berm musks and flicks its tail, and it goes right in Jesse's mouth.
Oh my God.
So now, we're trying to get this really nice serious shot for the camera that's going to be in a magazine, and I have a screaming daughter running around the house with me chasing her with the snake, trying to calm her down. She never forgave that snake.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Great.
I don't know. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say those are, I mean, everybody's got all kinds of crazy stories, but those are the two that just jumped out of my head real quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like them.
Good stuff. I don't know. Anything else, gents, that you want to hit on?
Nah, I mean, I got nothing but, I mean, basically just thank you, Keith, for jumping in with us. And of course, all the other stuff that you've helped us out with. And even, I mean, you could have easily just not given any single one of us on this line the time of day, but you totally did. And it's just been fantastic of a ride. And we definitely need to go back herping again, whether it is in Australia or United States or Eric's backyard, or I'll throw a rubber snake in your backyard, Keith, and then we can all like stand around it with a beer and be like, look, we found it. Like, yeah, I mean, like that's fine too. It all works out. So
yeah, absolutely. I'm ready, man. I told Rob the other day, I said, any trips you guys are planning, just count me in. And, unless the hell or high water comes along, keeps me from going, I'm down for any kind of adventure you guys plan.
Right.
I have a fear that if this, like, if we're going to go do like a rough scale adventure and this job won't let me leave, I have a fear that is when Owen will quit his job and then run to Australia.
Figure it out later, right?
And have to explain it to Melissa when I get home, like what happened. But like, yeah.
Owen, you've got 15 to 16 months.
Don't do this.
Plenty of time, bro.
Plenty of time.
All
Build
right.
up the time. Carry over what you can. Make
Work
it work.
like an animal. Got it.
Right on. Yeah, Keith, thanks for coming on and being the first guest on this. I hope the hope is that people will again appreciate things we take for granted today. Not only the equipment and the ability to contact people and knowledge, but just even the animals. I mean, just listening to you guys talk about how it was in the early days, and there was no morphs, and I'm kind of past that stage. I think in my reptile career, I don't know why. I'm just kind of like, I don't know. I'm sort of past that game of trying to make the next thing, and and more about depreciation for the species. And I think that's kind of where I'm at. But when I hear you guys talking about that, I think that more people should just think about that perspective for a minute. And I don't know, that's kind of what I came up in. Just wow, I can't believe I have a Woma python.
Right, exactly.
Like that kind of thing.
Yeah. And what is it doing out in the wild right now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wait, it digs? How the hell does it dig? It doesn't have hands.
Exactly. Yep.
I don't know. But I don't know. Any closing thoughts there, Rob?
I don't think so, man. I think that's great. As these guys have said, Keith, I really appreciate all the stuff that you've done for me personally and for the hobby generally. I think there's a ton there. And I mean, on my own behalf, I really appreciate having you as a herp and travel partner, and I look forward to a ton of great adventures going forward, starting June. Let's go to West Texas, try that again, get some indigo stuff, and we'll have a great time.
Yeah.
Please, God, give me the
We'll
days
go take
after
a helicopter into the NT, and then we'll go to Kimberly, and then we'll go back to FNQ. So many plans. We just have to make it wait for it to be possible, and then we'll do it.
Yeah,
sounds good, man. And I really appreciate all the kind words, guys. It really means a lot to me. I take all that stuff to heart. I don't blow it off as just a random comment. I really appreciate it, and means a lot to me. I really